By 1389, the Ottomans maintained an army of 40 to 50,000 across Anatolia and the Balkans, without the recurring payroll that would have bankrupted most rival states. Each year, campaign season triggered a familiar financial dilemma. Mercenaries insisted on immediate payment in silver, abandoning the cause as soon as funds dried up. Slave troops, on the other hand, needed only a single investment at the outset, not continuous pay. The initial price tag looked daunting. Yet, careful examination of tax data exposed a contradiction that would transform Ottoman military structure. By the end of this video, how that army grew for decades without a steady silver payroll will make sense. Capturing every fifth prisoner started to shift the empire's fortunes. Most of these prisoners were Christians from newly conquered Byzantine, Bulgarian, and Serbian lands. With every victory, the state gained new soldiers without spending extra money. This system turned loot from warfare into a steady stream of recruits, sparing the treasury's silver. Battles produced soldiers instead of bills. Conquest became a self-financing military pipeline, yet the initial training expense still loomed as a barrier no one had solved. Money seemed to vanish as quickly as confidence. On paper, hiring mercenaries appeared less costly at first. However, each new campaign drained the treasury further, requiring repeated payments every year. Slave soldiers required a big payment only once, with no recurring costs. The endless wage cycle of mercenaries vanished under the slave system. Over time, the math flipped. The initial expense of slaves became the smarter choice. Picture a treasury clerk watching reserves shrink after 3 exhausting campaigns in the Balkans. He faced a tough calculation: keep hemorrhaging silver every year, or endure a single, large outlay that would never recur. This forced a clear decision. The empire's future hung in the balance. What no one yet realized was that this risky fiscal approach would grant a unique advantage no paid army could achieve. Money only bought mercenary loyalty until the last coin changed hands. Success in the Balkans required balancing short-term savings against long-term stability. Mercenaries could not be trusted beyond their pay. Slave soldiers, raised and trained by the state, owed their lives to the Sultan. Only by examining every cost did the superiority of the slave army model emerge. Victory on the battlefield began to finance further expansion, converting each triumph into recruits. Every clash brought not just new lands, but also fresh manpower, something mercenary contracts could never provide. The system was brutal but efficient. Capture prisoners, invest in their training, and field them without ongoing wages. Each campaign supplied the next generation of troops, creating unstoppable momentum. The full economic advantage remained hidden until nearly a decade of conquest had been tallied. Soon, the close relationship between legal policy and tax revenue would transform the Ottoman military and administration at their core. The Pençik Law made conquest itself a revenue generator. After a successful raid, 1 out of every 5 captives went straight to the Sultan's training grounds. The state bypassed the slave markets completely. Christian communities in Bulgarian and Serbian territories became the main sources of these recruits. Victories on the battlefield created fresh manpower without draining the treasury. The greater the expansion, the more people were conscripted. However, each new province quietly increased an obligation that only revealed itself when expansion halted. Suddenly, their fiscal options collapsed. Hiring mercenaries the old way involved raising taxes or debasing money to pay soldiers. The Pençik system eliminated both choices. Now, gains from war shifted from quick loot to building a lasting military force. This change fundamentally altered how military campaigns were financed. And yet, this new cycle bred a dependence that was largely invisible at first. Every child drafted through this system changed the empire's internal makeup. Later, the devshirme process, forced conscription of Christian boys, formalized this approach. What seemed like a policy for filling the ranks actually served as a clever financial solution. Manpower was separated from direct costs. Silver stayed untouched in the treasury, instead of going to hired fighters. Records reveal grain usage climbing, while cash reserves stayed the same, something impossible with mercenary armies. The scheme functioned so seamlessly that few wondered what would happen once there were no more lands to seize. The real innovation lay not in the use of slave soldiers, but in making recruitment part of the expansion engine itself. Each campaign became a self-funding operation. For instance, the 1352 raids provided the troops needed for the 1354 seizure of Gallipoli, with no coins spent on recruitment. The system ran smoothly as long as new conquests kept coming. For treasury officials, the Pençik method meant one less reason for silver to drain away during wartime. Azov light infantry, recruited irregularly, often led Ottoman attacks. By the 1360s, the empire split into Anatolia and Rumelia, its two main provinces. Azovs dominated as the empire's principal light infantry. Yet, the clean simplicity of the accounts masked a deeper, tightening problem. Now, military success depended entirely on adding new territory. Strategic planning shifted. Leaders ceased to question whether victory was possible, and instead asked whether each new land would yield enough conscripts. Conquest had become a necessity, not merely an option. A deeper issue surfaced: could an empire become hooked on expansion when its military relied on a steady flow of new lands? Whenever expansion stopped, the empire suffered. Levy numbers dropped within a generation. The Pençik tax presented an odd puzzle. Why did a free revenue source create long-term financial dependence? The answer remains elusive, but that question is crucial. What becomes of an empire built on endless conquest when the borders freeze? The incentive system flipped the usual script. Most states taxed to finance armies. The Ottomans, by contrast, raised armies to avoid taxation. Every new territory yielded conscripts to conquer the next. The logistics of war became self-reinforcing. Rapid expansion during the late 1300s made this approach seem unbeatable. Decades of steady gains disguised the underlying fragility. Yet, speed is not the same as durability, and no one had considered the price of slowing down. A comparison of training costs and total service time reveals the financial logic behind the slave army. Each janissary cost about as much as 3 months' pay for a mercenary, but would serve for decades. The return on that investment far outstripped any rival approach. Yet, a more troubling question emerges: what happened when there were no more lands to conquer, and the supply of new recruits dried up? A slave conscript typically spent 4 to 8 years in preparation before seeing actual combat. Children, not adults, absorbed indoctrination much more consistently. As a result, age at capture became the main factor in selection. State administrators invested food and shelter for years into each candidate. Yet, the labor of apprentices compensated for this risk by providing unpaid work, firefighting, construction, and hauling supplies between regions. Infrastructure projects depended on youngsters too inexperienced to challenge their situation. Roads always needed work. Aqueducts demanded constant maintenance. Granaries had to be guarded, and paying these guards only with meals kept costs low. However, the scale of this system expanded more rapidly than anyone had foreseen. Nothing in the labor market came at that price. Infrastructure tasks poured out while the system grew. Once deployed, these soldiers expected no wages. Rations were fixed regardless of outcome. The figures were clear, except when the math ignored what couldn't yet be counted. Personal ambition for profit brought swift consequences. Any recruit caught learning a civilian trade or running a private side business was dismissed immediately. No outside earnings were allowed. This policy sealed off the system from external influences. No split loyalties, no market distractions, only pure focus on state orders. Soldiers became completely reliant on state provisions, with no alternate options. A blacksmith's apprentice could choose to quit. These men, though, had no option to leave, at least not until they realized they could. Meanwhile, mercenary pay steadily increased as local wars drove up demand. A freelance archer could bargain for new terms, each campaign and switch sides for higher pay, always expecting cash for every fight. Slave soldiers received only basic meals and occasional performance bonuses, no regular salary. Spanning 20 years, a single converted soldier cost less than 3 campaign seasons with hired fighters. But treasury officials shouldn't have focused only on that comparison. The biggest expense came early, during training. After that, converted soldiers cost only food, shelter, and rare bonuses. Military budgets stayed insulated from the market pressures that made hired troops unaffordable during long wars. grain prices shifted. Barracks sometimes needed repairs. Each fiscal period widened the gap between state spending and market demands, although no accountant measured the difference between what soldiers received and what they felt entitled to. Potential future problems had no place in current budgets. The numbers showed a system that could outlast mercenary forces that priced themselves out of existence. The model seemed flawless. Yet, what the figures missed was growing unseen. Gratitude had boundaries, and reliance created needs that basic rations couldn't meet. A hidden weakness ran through the system. Loyalty earned through childhood training and economic dependence had no historical example at such a scale. Those who approved each new draft had no way to know whether gratitude or bitterness would grow faster as the army grew from hundreds to thousands. Small groups followed routine. Large ones started to remember. Every advertised benefit had arrived, except for the one thing paperwork could never ensure: loyalty, and no amount of grain could guarantee it. Such a distinctive way of funding would deeply shape their military role and effectiveness. This was precisely the kind of structural tension that defined the Azovs, balancing local independence with the demands of a centralized military command. Funding for the Azovs, an irregular infantry force, came from provincial coffers rather than the empire's central treasury. These soldiers, mostly recruited from Turkoman communities in western Anatolia, served as the backbone of early Ottoman campaigns. Azovs wielded composite bows, spears, and swords, taking on the most dangerous role, enduring the first and heaviest casualties in battle. Positioned in trenches reinforced with sharpened stakes, they were tasked with weakening enemy lines before the empire's elite troops entered the fight. This setup transformed local tax revenue into a protective barrier for the central budget. If an Azov fell in combat, the financial impact bypassed the imperial treasury entirely. Death meant no pensions to pay and no further obligations. At Kosovo in 1389, Azov losses filled provincial registers while the imperial ledgers stayed untouched. All recruitment and outfitting costs landed on the shoulders of provincial governors. The empire's leadership enjoyed the military benefits without shouldering the expense of replacements. Surviving Azovs often found themselves assigned to garrison posts on the frontier. What kept governors willing to fund units whose survival offered them no return? Why, though, did local officials keep supporting a force whose survival didn't reward them? Losses were not accidental. They were part of the plan. Governors sent expendable soldiers to take the brunt of battle, keeping the valuable standing army intact for moments of strategic importance. This arrangement shifted the financial risk to the provinces, while the Sultanate claimed the rewards of victory. The sustainability of this model depended on a calculation no one had yet put into writing: the economics warrant examination. Azovs were cheap to field and cost nothing to replace because their expenses fell outside the central government's books: no direct payouts, no future liabilities. For example, a governor could raise 1,000 Azovs using several months' worth of local textile taxes, but if those men died in a single engagement, the Sultan's treasury remained untouched. But the system presumed governors would continue accepting losses without claiming the territorial gains those losses purchased. At a broader scale, this approach allowed the Ottomans to field disposable troops on a massive level. The elite janissaries, by contrast, were kept in reserve. Their long training periods were safeguarded by a front line deliberately designed to absorb losses. By 1389, the entire Ottoman force numbered between 40 and 50,000, a size only possible by pushing irregular infantry expenses to the provinces while channeling central funds into a smaller, permanent army. This division of financial responsibility masked the underlying tension between those who paid for expansion and those who ultimately controlled new lands. This pattern of battlefield organization persisted in various forms until the late 17th century. Governors continued to supply men. Azovs kept perishing. Janissaries consistently delivered victories. Such persistence suggested a stable system, but that stability depended on a bargain not yet fully explained by the sources. For imperial accountants tasked with weighing conquest against fiscal health, the Azov method offered a practical solution. Predictable losses became a manageable cost, always charged to someone else. A fundamental contradiction persisted. How long could provincial officials meet these recurring costs without insisting on a portion of the rewards their sacrifices had helped win? Continued campaigning only deepened this reliance. Each victory intensified the divide between those footing the bill and those reaping the benefits. In the Balkans, marcher lords eventually took advantage of this disparity, consolidating power over the revenue streams their military efforts had secured. In the Balkans, regional lords oversaw the major sources of revenue. Their coffers often surpassed the sums gathered by the central authorities in Anatolia during the mid-1400s. Akinenchi clans took taxes directly from newly conquered people, using the Timar system, a method where soldiers exchanged military service for taxable land grants. A soldier's earnings depended on the lands he was charged to defend. These fighters answered first to their local commanders, not the Sultan. Their allegiance gravitated toward the leader who paid them, and yet this loyalty built a hierarchy outside the Sultan's immediate control. When the palace gave no clear instructions, financial insecurity followed. On some occasions, messages never arrived. Treasury officials in the capital faced a deep dilemma. Expanding their territory brought more wealth. It also empowered lords who could threaten unity. As regional leaders grew richer through conquest, they gained leverage to withhold troops, bargain for better terms, or ignore imperial commands altogether. Centralization required breaking the connection between battlefield rewards and noble independence. Without that break, every victory quietly threatened the Sultan's grip on power. A solution to this growing problem had yet to be implemented. Allegiance among these troops came from calculated incentives, not inherited loyalty. Some soldiers, funded directly from the treasury rather than by land grants, bypassed local power holders. In this model, loyalty no longer relied on land income. Instead, it was forged through religious conversion, rigorous training, and direct payment from the state's own coffers. To a marcher lord, seeing his revenue streams diverted signaled the loss of power. Military centralization equaled financial displacement. And yet, the full impact of this displacement remained unmeasured. The accounts reveal the advantage plainly. Timar grants funneled revenue straight into the hands of the aristocracy, guaranteeing them a cut of future taxes before the state received anything. With direct extraction, however, taxes went to the central treasury first, which then financed a permanent army whose size and deployment the Sultan alone decided. Tax income became a tool for obedience. Marcher lords commanded independent power, but the Kapakulu answered to a single paymaster whose reach was still expanding. By the 1360s, the Sultanate had split into two main regions, Anatolia and Rumelia, yet financial control stayed scattered across countless Timur holders. Every land grant kept a portion of wealth outside the central treasury's reach. Each noble represented a new negotiation the Sultan needed to win. Handling these deals, one by one, undermined overall authority, despite superficial unity. A centrally funded slave army bypassed these negotiations, costing the treasury directly, but ensuring obedience without relying on aristocrats, except in areas where this system hadn't yet taken root. Strip away that revenue and military power centralizes quickly. This brings us to the Pençik tax paradox, an issue embedded in the budget for some time, the 1/5 tax on war captives. This levy did more than bankroll new soldiers. It redirected valuable captives from the hands of Timar lords to the direct service of the Sultan. No marcher family could claim every captive taken under Pençik. The tax was never just about raising money. It functioned as a tool to cut ties between local power bases and the military. Whether this tool was strong enough, however, still remained uncertain. Soon, mounting weaknesses would force the Ottomans to address the cracks in their military structure. The disaster at Ankara laid those weaknesses bare. In 1402, the battle at Ankara became a live dissection of the empire's financial structure. The Kapakulu Corps, structured to minimize ongoing costs rather than build depth, consisted of just a few hundred elite cavalry. Most of these men filled roles as royal attendants or personal bodyguards for the Sultan. Meanwhile, Timur's army forced the main Ottoman force to collapse. The treasury's slow-growth approach revealed a fatal weakness. There was no backup available to recover from a disaster. Emergency recruitment efforts failed to close the gap. Years of training lay embedded in each soldier, irreplaceable within the span of a campaign season. Delays only increased the price of keeping forces ready. Each new recruit meant long-term investment stretched out over years, not a one-time payment. Janissaries gained value slowly, as if accumulating interest the state couldn't touch in advance. Provincial conscripts simply lacked the discipline to serve as stand-ins for professionals. The financial model functioned perfectly, until an outside power forced the tempo of war. Behind the battlefield loss, a more complex financial failure was at work. The Treasury's records tell a different story. The Kapakulu system gambled on steady expansion, trading the regular pay of mercenaries for big upfront training expenses. Continued growth depended on setting the pace of war. Timur's mobility controlled when and where fighting happened, a flexibility the Ottomans couldn't match with their limited manpower. Timur had no reason to slow down to suit Ottoman needs. It was resource management, not tactics, that decided the outcome. Growing the corps required either an accelerated slave intake or a shift of funds away from other state needs. The central government had opted for neither strategy. Strict budgeting had made the army efficient, but also fragile. Timurid cavalry alone outnumbered the Kapakulu corps by a factor of 10 or more. A single major defeat wiped out reserves that would require years to restore. Training centers stood ready, but the strategic opportunity was already slipping away. For treasury officials who balanced investments between garrisons and training schools, Ankara meant seeing a decade's worth of effort erased in a single afternoon. The slave army's long-term savings disappeared the instant overwhelming scale was needed. Failing to fund the army's build-up phase left the Ottomans exposed to enemies who could quickly raise much larger forces. No financial instrument existed to convert future capacity into present strength, yet present strength was all that mattered now. A pressing structural issue came into sharp focus. Could a system built to avoid constant spending endure a crisis that demanded sudden, massive outlays? The efficiency that made the Kapakulu affordable during peace became a liability as soon as war outpaced the treasury's slow growth plan. Winning required large reserves. It also required the freedom to pick the moment of battle. The ledgers offered no way to price its absence. The power structure designed to centralize authority was tuned for a rhythm it ultimately could not control. The next century would test whether that flaw could be corrected, but only if the Sultanate survived long enough to make the attempt. That unwillingness to restructure would soon carry a price. The Kapakulu, built to escape the unpredictability of mercenary fees, grew into a powerful political player. Over time, they gained special perks, cash rewards, and the ability to influence royal succession. The cost-saving tactic became a trap. Financial relief transformed into a structure that could demand rather than obey. Within less than 100 years, the balance of power shifted from the state to the corps. With no outside source of income, their negotiating strength became absolute. Several structural advantages cemented their monopoly. Janissaries, unlike temporary mercenaries, lived permanently in barracks next to the palace. Their constant presence nearby gave them unparalleled group leverage. During times of disputed succession, they controlled direct access to the sovereign, acting as literal gatekeepers. Stationed so close to the heart of government, they could exchange their allegiance for greater rewards each time a new ruler came to power. In 1446, Janissaries rioted at Edirne and forced Murad II to reclaim the throne. The very force designed to defend the state now dictated its direction. Reversal was nearly complete, yet no mechanism existed to undo it. The blending of administrative and military traditions made vulnerabilities worse almost instantly. Combining Seljuk-style bureaucracy with the Mamluk system of military slavery created an organization protected from external influence. They borrowed the devshirme method from Byzantine practices and adopted Egyptian garrison routines, producing a corps accountable only to itself. Any move to dissolve the corps risked open rebellion. Cutting their numbers would spark mutiny, and any attempt at reform would be viewed as a betrayal. Leaders found themselves trapped, forced to choose which danger to face rather than how to escape. Permanent armies often trade one problem for another. The financial system that freed the empire from the chaos of seasonal mercenary wages now locked it into a never-ending payroll. These men, trained at government expense, armed from state stores, and quartered in the capital, became a fixed budget item that drained resources no matter what. In effect, the payroll now ruled over the treasury. Instead of serving fiscal needs, it dictated the terms of state finance. Those in charge of the accounts saw the warning signs slowly, then suddenly. The structures built to break the power of regional strongmen and contract captains only shifted that power inward. Authority now rested in a core that could not be dismissed, swapped out, or disregarded. The main obstacle to reform was no longer external actors or governors, but the very mechanism meant to save money. Every effort to cut costs faced united pushback, even though spending limits had already been reached. These standing forces demanded resources as the price for keeping order. The military slavery system solved the original budget problem by building a force shielded from financial restraint. Structural barriers were now firmly in place. Each new policy only made the system more rigid and impossible to change. What began as an answer to a crisis became a lasting restraint. No one had yet answered whether the core could be unmade without unmaking the empire itself. This early era laid the groundwork for dramatic changes to come in both weaponry and strategy. Archery had defined their dominance at first, until the arrival of gunpowder sparked a complete tactical transformation for the corps. In the corps' early years, archers formed its backbone, not soldiers wielding muskets. Their heads were shielded by pointed helmets with protective nasal bars. Arms found defense behind compact circular shields, leather stretched over wooden frames. These gear choices prioritized agility and rapid movement in combat above all. By keeping equipment simple, the Janissaries ensured low expenses. Any coins spent on armor meant less available for future campaigns. Local leather was plentiful and affordable, while imported steel required costly Venetian intermediaries and hard cash the empire rarely possessed. Winning required sacrifices, carefully calculated. The Azov infantry, cheaply raised and funded by provinces, absorbed the enemy's initial attack. Behind them, slave soldiers launched precise assaults from strongholds. The military's doctrine matched its finances: spend little, gain much, avoid future obligations. When Azovs fell in battle, the central treasury suffered no financial loss. Dead conscripts needed no pensions, no payments to widows, and no elaborate funerals, saving money for coming wars. This calculus governed both spending and battlefield risk. Fragmented loyalties forced the empire to rethink its finances. Cavalry supported by the Timar system gave regional notables control over income streams the Sultan could not access. Slave soldiers, in contrast, owed their loyalty directly to the imperial center and were funded through ongoing conquests, not salaries or land grants. Economic pressures drove these institutional choices. Volunteer soldiers demanded higher pay after each victory. Janissaries received the same fixed stipends, regardless of outcome. Once trained, they needed only food and the occasional replacement item to remain operational. No alternative solved the challenge of centralization. Relying on local cavalry only strengthened regional leaders, making them harder to control. Military slavery addressed both problems. It removed soldiers from the wage market and cut their ties to regional power. Because they could not sell their skills elsewhere, Janissaries had no leverage to demand higher pay. These soldiers owned no property and held no independent standing. Every claim on their labor ran through the state. Empires that tried other models watched their treasuries drain or their provinces pull away. A fractured treasury demanded troops whose loyalty did not spark revolt. Paying in cash attracted mercenaries, who vanished as soon as wages stopped. Grants of land bred local warlords, diverting tax funds into their own pockets. The slave soldier system avoided both pitfalls. Instead, it provided fighters the Sultan could command directly, funded not with precious metals, but with prisoners taken during battles. Captured enemies came at no extra cost. They were already there, transformed from adversary into future soldier. The matter was settled by exclusion. Real centralization required an army that was cheap to keep, but expensive to replace. What no ledger yet showed was whether the system could fund itself once expansion slowed. If this reframes how you think about it, drop your take below. The analysis continues.